Very good evening and welcome to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Xuan Yo and I'm one of the 2 Ath Fellows this year. Uncertainty is a major and recurring theme in the study of autism. According to Rose Eveleth at The Atlantic, charting where an individual falls on the autism spectrum is nearly impossible, and that the terms high functioning and low functioning have little medical meaning. The massive amount of uncertainty surrounding autistic spectrum disorders is one of the reasons why organizational attempts to deal with autism have resulted in not a single autism policy, but a vast array of policies at the federal, state, and local levels, which often leave people with autism and their families frustrated and confused. Our speaker tonight is no stranger to the Claremont McKenna community. John J. Pitney Jr. is Roy P. Crocker Professor of American History and Politics at CMC, where he teaches courses on interest groups, political parties, mass media, and of course, Congress. A leading expert on the structure and practice of American politics, Pitney is a widely published author or co-author of 6 books on American politics, including The Art of Political Warfare and the Politics of and the Politics of Autism. In addition to his books, Pitney has published numerous scholarly articles and short essays, and is a regular contributor to newspapers and magazines. He's featured regularly as well on NPR and other television and radio programs. Pitney has not only shaped the study of government at CMC for nearly 30 years, he has also helped shape government itself through his many roles, including as the acting director for the research department of the Republican National Committee and as the Senior Domestic Policy Analyst for the U.S. House Republican Research Committee, among other important appointments. Pitney holds a BA in Political Science from Union College, where he was co-valedictorian, and a PhD in Political Science from Yale, where he was a National Science Foundation Fellow. He received the CMC Presidential Award in 2013 and was named one of the 300 best professors in the U.S. by the Princeton Review in 2012. Professor Pitney returns to the Athenaeum this evening with his latest book, The Politics of Autism, which examines the political and policy issues surrounding autism in the United States. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording is strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Professor Pitney.
Thank you. Okay, as you know, I like to wander around the stage, so I'm not going to stay behind the podium. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. So, Politics of Autism. When you study public policy, there's sort of a standard template for the study of public policy. You define a problem, identify potential solutions, estimate the costs and benefits of potential solution, and then go through a rational process of choosing. Well, what do you do when you have a situation of radical uncertainty? And that's the puzzle that we confront with autism. How much of it is there? Well, as we'll discuss, we're not really sure. What causes it? Well, we don't really know that either. What is it? What is it? Well, that's not absolutely clear either. Other kinds of medical issues, say a broken leg. Well, you take an x-ray, bang, there it is. It's not like that with autism. It is defined generally as a disorder of social communication, but there is a lot of disagreement over what it means, over what its boundaries are, and because of that, we don't have a clear sense of how much of it there is or whether it's increased or decreased over the years. So this is an extremely challenging issue both for the practice and the study of public policy. The very definition itself is political. The question over what autism is political. And trying to superimpose a quote-unquote rational process on the situation of radical uncertainty is very difficult indeed. So uncertainty is one of the major themes of the book, but there are 2 others. Uncertainty, complexity. Complexity, not only the complexity of autism itself, which is extremely daunting. There's a saying in the autism community, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. That is, people with autism are just as complicated and diverse as everybody else. And there is no single defining characteristic. Two people with autism, two people with quote-unquote high-functioning autism can be very, very different in their personalities and in their skill sets. So that's one level of complexity. But the policy response is complex as well. Okay, I see lots of familiar faces, both current and former Gov 20, right? Okay, you remember from when we discussed federalism, how many governments are there in the United States? 89,000. 89,000 governments in the United States, and most of them, in one way or another, have something to do with autism. Local school districts, police forces have something to do with autism. Local public health organizations. It is really complicated when you have 89,000 governments and multiple agencies at any level of government. You have an extremely complicated government structure. The third defining characteristic, we have uncertainty and complexity. The third is conflict. Here's the best way to describe autism politics. Autism politics is like faculty politics on crystal meth. Okay, this crowd, that gets a knowing response. We know what faculty politics can get like, right? Oh, faculty politics is an absolute love fest compared with autism politics. Autism politics, you are literally talking about a realm where people get death threats. And I'm not exaggerating. There is a leading researcher of vaccines, a guy named Paul Offit, and he tells a story of somebody telling about his concern with autism, and he says, I'm sure your children, you care about your children, and then the guy started describing the way his children walked to school in the morning. It was clearly a death threat. And this is what happens. This is an issue that, when you think about it, involves people's lives on a deep level. If you're a parent, it's really all about your children's future. And people get very desperate. If you're a person with autism, it's about your identity. It's about who you are. These are the most fundamental problems that you can think of. And it's natural that people get very passionate about it. And you can't settle these arguments by reference to science by saying, well, we know what the solution to this question is because look at the research, because the science is so uncertain. And hence, the politics will remain complicated and contentious for a long time to come. Let me give you a short history of autism. Autism has probably always been with us, although the word was not coined until, in the way we use it, not coined until 1943. People who study it think that feral children, you probably saw the Truffaut movie, The Wild Child, about, I see some people responding about a child found out in the woods, initially thought that the children were abandoned and raised by animals. That's not what happened. There were probably children with developmental disabilities who were simply abandoned by their parents for short periods of time and then found. Autism also showed up in institutions, in what used to be called asylums. And that's probably true when you think about it. For centuries, people on the spectrum had horrible outcomes. They were just thrown away. But I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation which suggests that that can't possibly be the only thing that happened to people with autism. I just did a conservative estimate of autism prevalence. I just picked the number 1 in 150, which is very conservative, and compared it to the number of people in institutions for what was previously called mentally retarded or institutions for people with mental handicaps. And those numbers couldn't possibly account for all the people with autism. So what happened to them? We don't know. We don't know what happened to previous generations of people with autism. Did they simply stay at home? Possibly. Did they get jobs that didn't require a great deal by way of social contact? Were they working in the fields? Were they working in menial factory jobs? We don't know. We probably will never know. And that's one of the great uncertainties because we don't have a historical baseline for autism. Autism as we know it was coined in 1943 by a man named Leo Kanner. Fellow at Johns Hopkins University who practically invented child psychiatry. And he wrote an article in 1943 in a journal that we no longer is published, journal called Nervous Child. That was the actual name of the journal, Nervous Child. Some people are nodding. You're familiar with the literature. Remarkable essay because he got so much right. Because in that one essay, he coined a lot of the terminology that we use unto this day. And what's also remarkable, the very first person he diagnosed is still alive. A couple of years ago, a reporter for The Atlantic tracked him down. He's found out his name is Donald Triplett, and he lives in Mississippi. He's in his 70s now. And fortunately, he ended up having a pretty good life. However, and this alludes to things I'll talk about in a minute, the fate of people on the spectrum is tied up to their socioeconomic status. Donald Triplett came from an affluent white family in Mississippi. If he came from a poor African-American family in Mississippi, you can be pretty sure his life would have been terribly, terribly different. Now, Kanner, again, was a great scientist, but he made a couple of really consequential mistakes. Number one, and this was puzzling for a scientist to make a mistake like this. He said, well, people with autism tend to come from well-educated families. Well, of course. Who else would show up at Johns Hopkins University in 1943 finding the only child psychiatrist in the country? Well, duh. So he never figured out that it was a massive referral bias. And that, of course, we see echoes of that theme even now. Belief that there's a so-called geek syndrome, that people in places like Silicon Valley are much more likely to have children with autism, but that's largely, again, variations of referral bias. Another mistake he made had harsher consequences. He went back and forth on the issue of causation, but in the 1950s and 60s, he alluded to what became known as the refrigerator mother theory that it was the coldness of the parents that was responsible for autism. And the exact quotation was that autistic kids were the product of parents who, quote, who were just, quote, happening to defrost enough to produce a child. Hold that thought. Now, at the same time, there is another doctor coming up with fairly similar conclusions, fairly similar observations. But he's working in Austria in the 1940s. Gee, you think that maybe not a lot of Americans are keeping up with this guy because he's writing A, in German, B, behind enemy lines. His name was Hans Asperger. Yes, the guy who gave the world the name that we become familiar with, Asperger syndrome, although he himself did not coin that term. It would not be until many years that his research would become widely known in the English-speaking research community as a result of a British researcher named Lorna Wing. So put Asperger aside for a second. The refrigerator mother hypothesis is taken up by another scholar of sorts, Bruno Bettelheim. Some of you may have seen his work on the uses of enchantment. For a while, he was the most famous quote-unquote psychologist in the United States. I put scare quotes around that word because he wasn't actually a psychologist. He was actually kind of a fraud. His degree was in aesthetics. But the terrible thing that Bettelheim did was codify the refrigerator mother theory. He wrote a book in 1967 called The Empty Fortress, that a lot of which was apparently based on manufactured material. He just made stuff up. He was much more direct and explicit and harsh about the causes of autism. And the exact quote from The Empty Fortress is, "The precipitating factor in infantile autism is the parent's wish that the child should not exist." So he came flat out and blamed mothers. This had two horrible consequences. Number one, it kept the issue off the political agenda. Well, if it's just bad parenting, government can't do anything about it. And number two, it set back autism research by years because a lot of practitioners believed it. And to this day, in France, for some reason, these theories are still prevalent and still influence the treatment of people with autism. However, in the 60s, also the beginnings of a pushback, a resistance to this school of thought began not far from here in San Diego. A fellow named Bernard Rimland, a psychologist, worked for the Navy, whose son was autistic. And Rimland scoured all the existing scientific literature and wrote a book called Infantile Autism, concluding accurately that it was something that was happening in the brain. It had nothing to do with cold parents or anything like that. We know now Rimland was absolutely right on that. Rimland would later err on something else. But on this issue, Rimland was right. And gradually, during the 1970s, psychologists and psychiatrists began to realize that Rimland was right and Bettelheim was wrong. Meanwhile, other things are happening to put autism on the political agenda. We have the civil rights movement. Now you may wonder, what does the civil rights movement have to do with autism? The answer is a lot. Civil rights movement for African American equality in the 1950s and 1960s set the template for other American social movements, especially the disability rights movement. Disability rights movement very directly and explicitly used the tactics, the language, and the legislative proposals of the original civil rights movement. There were some important court decisions that shaped special education in the 1970s, very directly and explicitly based on precedents from civil rights. Also, the civil rights movement learned something about tactics. Disability rights movement learned about tactics. And in the 1980s, you had a movement for protection of disability rights that culminated in 1990 in the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. In the meantime, you had an uprising at Gallaudet College in Washington, D.C., Deaf Pride. And that would become very, very influential as a model for the autism movement, for the autism self-advocacy movement. And if you talk to people in that movement, they will point to Gallaudet as one of their touchstones. So we begin to see a broader disability rights movement in the 1970s and 1980s. As I mentioned, one key development in 1990 was the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Another one that didn't get nearly as much attention at the time, but would be extremely consequential, is a change in the existing federal special education law. In 1990, it was renamed IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. As those of you who've taken my Congress class know, members of Congress love clever acronyms. We have the Patriot Act, which is a clever acronym, and well, IDEA, the figured they say, okay, we have to have a clever acronym. So IDEA, it was. But the important point wasn't the renaming of the law. It was that in 1990 it required school districts to start gathering information, start collecting statistics on the number of people on the autism spectrum who were receiving services. When you count something, you start finding it. And so if you look in the data from the education department, the number of students receiving services for autism, you don't get any data prior to the 1990s because nobody was collecting it. But early 1990s, the line moves up sharply. This leads many people to think, oh my God, there is an epidemic of autism. Maybe, or maybe, it's diagnostic substitution. That is, people counting autism where they didn't count it before. Either people who didn't have any kind of special ed designation, or people who would previously had received special ed services under another label, such as intellectual disability. And there's a lot of evidence that the latter has a great deal to do with it. It's called diagnostic substitution. And speaking of diagnosis, other major changes are occurring at the time. The DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, which started as a way of keeping statistics. And then insurance companies figured, aha, this is a great device for us to determine how much we pay for various procedures. So the character of the DSM changed over time, and it became a much more elaborate document, and over time it began to include autism, and a crucial change in the early 90s, it not only included autism, but Asperger syndrome. And again, Asperger himself never called it that. But it was added to the DSM, and again, when you find a name for something, you call it something, you're going to find more of it. And consequently, between the changes in the education law and the changes in the psychiatric manual, in the 1990s, people are all of a sudden seeing more and more autism. We see more of it in popular culture. A lot of you have probably seen the movie Rain Man. That introduced high-functioning autism to a generation of Americans. I remember it was the first term I ever encountered, the term high-functioning. Now, by the way, Rain Man is both good and bad. On the one hand, the good side, it raised awareness of autism. On the bad side, it created wildly unrealistic expectations. In all of human history, there have been maybe half a dozen people who had the ability that the Dustin Hoffman character had in that movie. That is not typical of people with autism. So you meet a person with autism, don't ask them to count cards. Most people on spectrum, sorry, they can't do it. Maybe they're perfectly good blackjack players, but they can't do that. Okay. So that gets autism on the agenda. Now, here's the problem with the DSM and the science of autism. How do we determine whether somebody has autism? There is no brain scan that reliably diagnoses autism. They're still working on that. But as yet, there's no test. It's not that you can take a person, lie them on the table, slap the machine on them and say, oh, okay, yeah, autism. Doesn't work that way. There's no blood test. They're working on that too. Don't have it yet. Only way you can diagnose autism is either by observing behavior or interviewing people who've observed the behavior. And there are a couple of standard forms for doing this. The ADOS and the ADI, which are forms that were only developed late 1980s. And again, if you want reliable statistics on autism, you're not going to find them prior to this time because nobody was gathering them. But once you have more and more people using the ADOS and the ADI, at that point you start identifying more autism. The only trouble is, if you look in a statistics book, you say, okay, well, how many people have autism? You're not going to find that. Because even to this day, the estimates of autism are not based on random sample surveys of the entire population. They've never done that. Even the Centers for Disease Control, if you actually read past the headline and look in the second, third, and fourth paragraphs, you're finding these are based on studies done in a few select cities, not nationwide samples. So you'll hear the statistic that the prevalence of autism is 1 in 168. Yeah, could be true, but we don't have really hard, firm data. Similarly, the data from the schools means that more and more students are receiving services for autism, but are there more students with autism than there used to be? We don't know. Maybe, maybe not. And of course, this uncertainty makes things difficult for researchers and scientists. What causes it? Well, if you don't even know what the baseline is, and you don't know if there's been an increase, that makes determining causation pretty darn difficult. Let me read you a list. I've gone through the literature pretty carefully. Here's a list of potential causes of autism that have been the subject of peer-reviewed literature. Mind you, we're not talking about somebody's wild speculations. We're not talking about Ben Carson fantasizing. We're talking about actual, real, live, peer-reviewed literature. Potential causes and correlates of autism. Pesticides, air pollution, proximity to freeways, maternal thyroid issues, autoimmune disorders, induced labor, preterm birth, birth by cesarean section, paternal and maternal obesity, maternal and paternal age, maternal post-traumatic stress disorder, smoking during pregnancy, antidepressant use during pregnancy, and the list goes on. That's just a sample. And again, every one of these has been the subject of a peer-reviewed article. So we do know one thing. Genetics is part of it. Yes. Ever since the early days of autism research, we've known that there's a tendency for it to run in families. That part of it we do know, but the genetic contribution, what percentage, remains uncertainty. Of course, the most popular theory in some circles is vaccines. How come? Anybody familiar with the term post hoc ergo propter hoc? Post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. Here's what happens. Autism is a disorder of social communication. Well, 1-year-olds aren't doing a whole lot of social communication. However, you start seeing more and more social communication, language, gestures around the age of 2. Which, if a child is on the autism spectrum, is when you start noticing things around the age of 2. Also, the age of 2 is when you give kids the MMR shot, measles, mumps, rubella. So what happens? A lot of parents give their kids the MMR shot. A couple of months later, kids diagnosed with autism, and obviously, parents figure, okay, MMR shot, autism, MMR shot, caused the autism. And in the late 1990s, there was a guy named Andrew Wakefield, published an article in The Lancet, which seems strongly to suggest that the MMR shot was in fact implicated in autism. The article later turned out to be fraudulent. Years later, Lancet withdrew the article, which in its very long history it doesn't do very often, and Wakefield was stripped of his medical license in Britain. Nevertheless, the vaccine theory took off, and people become passionate believers in it. And if you go on Amazon and look at the reviews of my book, the one negative review is by one of these believers in the vaccine theory. And they have their own websites, their own publications. It's kind of a scary subculture, kind of like Scientology or something like that. But as we saw in recent presidential debates, we've had candidates pandering to this school of thought, which is not very helpful in developing autism policy. Another aspect of the cure, remember I talked about complexity and contention. Well, the vaccine theory is one point of contention, but the very idea that we should be looking for a cure is another point of contention. Because obviously from the parent perspective, kid has autism, we need the pill for autism. And one of the early autism organizations was called Cure Autism Now. But look at it from the perspective of the person with autism. A lot of people with autism say, I am a human being. I do not need to be cured. This is the way I am. This is who I am. It's part of the diversity of human experience. The term is neurodiversity. And this is just part of normal human variation. And again, when there was a law called the Combating Autism Act, activists mounted a hashtag campaign that said, hashtag, stop combating me. And as a result of this activism, they changed the name of the law to the Autism Cares Act. However, to this attitude, you get pushback from parents. And parents find this attitude to be troublesome. Here's what one parent writes. Anyone with a mental and verbal ability to challenge autism research is not autistic on a scale that I care to recognize. Opposition to finding a cure is particularly hurtful to parents who still mourn the loss of the child that could have been. A line has been crossed. And just a couple of weeks ago, I was talking with a parent, and I was recounting a discussion I'd had with Ari Naiman, who's a leader of self-advocacy, and this parent was extremely indignant and was very upset with me and said, I do not recognize him as being autistic. So we're talking about really deep, serious divisions and emotions here. Now, with education, I talked about contention and uncertainty. For most kids, the education system in the United States is the main vehicle for government policy on autism. And it's difficult for parents to navigate. If a child is under 3, under federal law, your first stop is the Individualized Family Service Plan, the IFSP, which maps out early intervention, EI. After age 3, children get an Individualized Education Program, IEP, for their local education agency, an LEA, that is their school system. The IEP explains how children will receive a free appropriate public education, FAPE, F-A-P-E, in the least restrictive environment, LRE. The program may include speech therapy, ST, occupational therapy, OT, physical therapy, PT, adaptive physical education, APE, and applied behavior analysis, ABA. And the interventions of ABA include DTT, of course, which is discrete trial training. There's an attorney who observes, given the confusion that all these unhelpful acronyms are causing for parents and professionals, it is not without irony that autism is associated with communication dysfunction. Now think about it. If you're a parent on the autism spectrum, this is the language you have to learn. This is what you have to deal with. You have to deal with an amazingly complicated system, and a system that has severe inequalities. On one side of the table at the IEP meeting are the parents. On the other side are representatives of the school system. And the school system, like every bureaucracy, is trying to minimize expenses. The parents with the resources to understand and navigate the system are going to do better than the parents who don't. Special ed places an enormous premium on parents serving as advocates for their children. Let's say, just hypothetically, you had, again, I don't know why I give this example, but totally hypothetically, let's say you had a pair of parents, one of whom has a PhD from Yale, experience in government and has written perhaps something about autism and is married to a lobbyist with a degree in public policy from Harvard. These hypothetical parents, shall we say, are computer generated to be effective autism parents because they know exactly what to do. They know how to work government. They know how to do research. They know how to identify the best lawyer in the region. And while not being wealthy, they have at least enough money to hire said lawyer. These parents are going to do well. Who's not going to do well? Parents who don't have the money, don't have the education, don't have the connections, don't have the sophistication. Those kids are going to go end up in a quote-unquote special ed classroom. Who's in a special ed classroom? You're going to have some kids with high-functioning autism, some kids with low-functioning autism, kids with Down syndrome, kids with cerebral palsy, kids with all kinds of different problems, put them all together, and nobody in that room gets what he or she actually needs. And that's one of the major problems in this world, is the inequality that results from the complexity of the system. Then there's the cliff. The idea, federal law idea, is great until you reach your 22nd birthday. It no longer applies. It's called falling off the cliff. Parents call it the cliff. Idea also does not apply to college. So what happens to adults on the autism spectrum? To a large extent, we don't know. We do know that the services outside the educational system are just as complicated as the services within the system, though much less consistent. And various states have tried to deal with this by mandating insurance coverage. What do you do outside the school system? Well, states say, okay, we're going to make the insurance companies pay. And 43 states in the District of Columbia have passed these laws, including California. So far, so good. Yay, nobody likes the insurance companies, right? I sure don't. There's a huge catch. Number one, these laws do not apply to self-funded plans. Those plans are governed by a federal law, ERISA. And so about half the people who think they might get coverage aren't eligible. Number two, a lot of the laws have various age caps, amount caps, all the bells and whistles that insurance companies love to put in policies so they don't have to pay. You sort of get the idea. I kind of have it in for insurance companies. Yeah, different story. As a result, these 43 states do not provide as much service through the insurance system as one might think. And Medicaid coverage of autism is wildly inconsistent from state to state. And as a result, you get people with autism to the age of 22, what happens to them? Again, the data are fragmentary but not terribly encouraging. About half of them have been bullied. About 4 in 10 young adults on the spectrum have never worked for pay between high school and their early 20s. Only 1 in 5 young adults on the spectrum ever lived away from parents without supervision between high school and their early 20s. This is one study. There's a great deal that we do not know about young adults on the spectrum. Now, we don't know if the actual prevalence has increased. Again, tremendous uncertainty in that we lack a baseline. It's one thing we can say with some confidence, however. The number of people with a diagnosis or designation of autism is definitely going to increase over time. That we're sure of. And the American social service system is going to have a very interesting problem in the years ahead because there is another development taking place simultaneously. Baby boomers. We're getting older. And the number of people with Alzheimer's is going to increase dramatically in the years ahead. And there's going to be a tremendous demand for home health care workers. A lot of the people who would otherwise be taking care of people with autism are going to be taking care of people with Alzheimer's. So how are we going to take care of everybody? That is a really interesting question, and I don't know what the answer is. Maddie Davidson is writing her senior thesis on Alzheimer's. I hope she figures it out. Another thing, more and more people on the spectrum are going to college, which is great. In previous decades, they wouldn't have had the opportunity. They wouldn't have had the ABA in grade school and high school. But we need to do a great deal more to help people on the spectrum navigate college and navigate the employment system. And that's a challenge that every college is going to have to face in the years ahead. And there's a lot that we need to know. Obviously, we need to know more about the science. I keep talking about autism as if it were one thing. It's probably a variety of different conditions. Probably in the years ahead, we're not going to be talking about autism singular, we'll talk about autisms plural. That's obvious to anybody who spends time with autistic people. They're very different. The diagnosis of Asperger was abolished in the most recent edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. My layman's opinion, so labeled, is that it will come back. I know people with Asperger, I know people with other forms of high-functioning autism. My own belief is that people with Asperger are distinct and different. And there's some scientific literature to back that up. We need more research on behavioral interventions. We need to know more about what happens to adults. We need to think through some of the ethical problems. Suppose we did have some kind of medical cure for autism. Take a pill, autism goes away. Well, think about it, that has ethical implications because autism involves the entire brain. So if you're taking away autism, you're turning a person from one kind of a person into another kind of a person. What are the ethical implications of that? That's a difficult issue. But the most important thing, and I'll close with this, is for much of the history of autism politics, it's been about the parents, people like me. The parents started a lot of the major organizations, but we're not the only stakeholders. The people with autism are the stakeholders. And what we need to do as we develop autism policy is make sure that people with autism are included. People with autism are not just the objects of public policy, they're our fellow citizens. They're people. They have a right to live the kind of life they want to live. One of the major organizations is called Autism Speaks, and indeed, autism does speak. And the rest of us need to listen. And with that, be happy to take questions.
So we now have time for questions. So if you have one, please raise your hand, and Shwen or I will come to you. And priority goes to students, as always.
Hello, thank you, Professor, so much for your talk. I had a question actually on the classification of autism, and as more research progresses, like maybe different types of autism in the DSM. That's why if you could speak a little bit to what the utility of classification would be. If it's better just to have people with autism be able to identify, like as they like, and I guess proclaim that as their own identity, or if it's better actually to have classifications of autism for political and medical purposes.
That's a great question. And that leads to a dilemma. If you subdivide autism, you may be dividing the community. On the other hand, from a therapeutic standpoint, and again, I am sort of getting out of my lane here because I'm a political scientist, not a therapist, but more precise classification is useful in helping determine what kind of therapy people should get. It's a cliche, but it applies here more than anywhere else. One size does not fit all. A kind of a behavioral program that might work great for one person might not work at all for another. And if we have a clearer classification system, we might be able to be in a better position to fit the therapy to the person. So I think that's the major value. Though from a political standpoint, what you're mentioning is very much on point. Yeah.
I'm a therapist in Illinois, and the other issue with it is depending what information you gather in the assessment is going to drive where you go in the DSM, and the insurance companies drive from what is paid for. The sicker somebody is mentally ill, the higher the coverage is, period. So there's a lot of, things going on that drives things where
Yeah,
it's
and
not
one
really
of the
clear.
sources of uncertainty is that doctors and other forms of therapists are aware of this, and I have a quotation which I took from Roy Grinker. One psychiatrist says, "In my scientific practice, in my scientific work, I'm very precise and conservative, but as a therapist, I will call a kid a zebra if I have to, in order to get that kid the services I think he needs." And that, of course, introduces a distortion in the data. So in some cases, we might have overdiagnosis. In other cases, we might have underdiagnosis, people who aren't even showing up on the system, which, again, gets to the first issue of uncertainty.
Hello. So one of the things that you talked about that I thought was particularly interesting is the difficulty we have of tracking individuals who become adults with autism. It seems like to me the one unifying thing, or most unifying thing, would be the healthcare field in assisting to track individuals with autism. Do you think that the medical profession has a role in that? And I guess, how do you think it can contribute?
Okay, first thing about the medical profession is this. A lot of times when parents have concerns about their kids, they go to pediatricians. That's the point of entry to the medical system. It's getting a little better now, but if you talk to people with experience in this, pediatricians, at least until the very recent past, were terrible at recognizing and dealing with autism. They just didn't know it. I know of a case very closely. Pediatrician, a kid stimmed right in front of the pediatrician, right before his eyes. He didn't catch that it was a sign of autism. So that's a problem. What do we know about physicians treating older patients and what they know about autism? Actually, the survey evidence is limited, but it suggests they don't really know. So educating the medical profession about autism, particularly about the unique challenges of adults on the spectrum, is something that we have to do, and that's a responsibility of the medical profession, not just pediatricians, but physicians across the spectrum, unto and including gerontologists. Because a kid with autism is going to grow up to be an adult with autism who's going to grow up to be an old person with autism. And physicians across that spectrum will have to learn to deal with it.
Hi, I have a question with regards to your perspective and experience on how can one bring about advocacy, as you mentioned before, bring acknowledgement of autism, but in low-income communities, specifically, at least from my own experience, Latino communities, where you have individuals who are in between cultures, understanding the identification of autism within the U.S., but if you're bringing individuals from other countries or
Sure.
immigrants, navigating that
Yes.
social dynamic first, but then also the lack of resource and
Absolutely.
understanding and within this context in the
Yeah,
U.S.
and Autism Speaks, which is very controversial, I will tell you. Autism Speaks is the big dog in autism politics. And if you talk to a group of people, you're going to get really different reactions to it. The vaccine people think it's evil because they don't buy the vaccine theory, but the self-advocates think it's evil because they don't do enough to include self-advocates. So again, it's controversial, but this is one of the things they're working on. And there are a variety of challenges. You mentioned income. The challenge of advocacy when you don't necessarily have the money for lawyers or don't have the educational background to deal with the specialists. The cultural side of it is tricky, and they're only beginning to deal with this. Because autism may express itself differently in different cultures. For example, one of the ways in which you diagnose autism is the lack of eye contact. Well, eye contact differs by culture. In some cultures, children are taught not to make eye contact with adults, and that complicates the issue. So we're really only at the beginning of being able to deal with this, but Autism Speaks has had very specific programs trying to raise awareness of this issue in Latino communities, African American communities, but there's so much more that needs to be done. Here in Los Angeles County, with how many languages are spoken in this county? 200? And there are people on the spectrum in all 200 languages. So that is a huge challenge.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to speak. This has been really great. I was particularly struck when you said that the people who are the ultimate stakeholders are the people with autism, because that's so true. I mean, these people living with autism are just that, people who have rights. But I'm wondering, how do you begin to facilitate the conversation in helping people who live with autism make their own decisions and exercise their rights? You touched a little bit on the ethics of the issue. There's also the ethics, if you have someone and you're considering their decision-making capabilities, how do you take that into account, that kind of thing? As a parent, as a therapist.
And it's complicated. The conventional wisdom used to be, and you look at the literature from just a few years ago, it would say a majority of people with autism also have intellectual disability, which is actually not true. What happened was they would give quote-unquote intelligence tests to people with autism who might have trouble with attention to task, and they'd bomb, even though they could be extremely bright. It just didn't show up in the test. And they're finding more and more that people with autism are smart as anybody else, maybe more so. Problem here is a number of people with autism have difficulty speaking. So one thing in the short run, that if I had $1 gazillion, if I were Bill Gates, if I had $1 gazillion to spend, one thing I'd make absolutely sure is that every single nonverbal person with autism had an iPad or an assistive device so that he or she could say whatever he wanted to say. That is the most concrete and specific thing that we could do. And there's a lot, I think some of the priorities in autism research are a little off. We're pouring so much money into genetics when what's happening is, if you've been in academia long enough, you know how this works. Geneticists have all this neat research they want to do and find out there's a pot of autism money, so they just say, yeah, this is autism research. Yeah, that's the ticket. My genetic research is autism related, even though it doesn't actually help anybody. So take some of that money and buy people iPads and assistive devices so they can speak, so they can get the message out. There's a little known book, but it's a wonderful short book published locally, published privately actually, Ido in Autism Land, about Ido Kadar, who was originally considered low functioning until he was able to communicate with an assistive device, and the guy's a wonderful writer. So that's the most concrete answer I can think of to that issue.
Yeah, if I might comment here. I'm on the autism spectrum. Again, I'm only one person of autism, so don't take my word as gospel. But my parent, I consider myself very fortunate among autistic people because my parents were able to negotiate with the school to keep me out of those special ed classrooms. And I think that might be part of the key to encouraging self-advocacy. Just putting them in the same classrooms as everyone else so they're taught that they have the same rights as everyone else.
Absolutely.
Hi, Professor Pitney. Thank you for coming to speak to us. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about some of the issues or sort of the struggles with language, with not like with speaking abilities, but like things like you mentioned, quote unquote, high functioning, low functioning, those sorts of language that is used to describe people with autism that has been people have charged that as having sort of problems inherent in it. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about sort of the language that we use to advocate for people and the language that people use to advocate for themselves and sort of the issues there.
Yeah, and it's a tough one because of the variation in the autism spectrum. Because on the one hand, you have people with autism who are verbal, who can speak extremely well, who can be in school plays, and others who can't speak at all. So there's got to be some language to encompass the difference of abilities. I'm not comfortable saying high functioning and low functioning. I hope somebody comes up with better terminology. I'm not clever enough to invent it. But I think we do have to be careful how we speak of people. It wasn't that long ago, in the case of people with intellectual disability, we used terms like moron and imbecile as descriptors, and not these terrible insulting terms were used for people. And that's another reason why we need to bring people with autism into the conversation. They're the stakeholders. And also I would say, from the standpoint of my interest groups class, we're going to see more and more people with autism speaking for themselves. I mentioned Ari Naiman. There's a group called the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, which consists of people on the spectrum. And Ari is a very impressive and formidable person. I don't mean that in the condescending impressive for a disabled person. No, the guy was 24 and on a presidential commission. I say that's impressive no matter who you are. And we're going to see more and more advocacy like that. And that's going to be the biggest change in autism politics we're going to see in the near future.
Thank you for a great talk. My question is about the issue of disclosure. This is for an adult with autism, high functioning, seeking a job, and the conflict that that adult has between disclosing that he has or he is on the spectrum or she is on the spectrum versus not disclosing. That causes a lot of conflict, a lot of stress. And can you talk to attitudes towards that or pros and cons related to that?
Yes, that is a terrific question. In fact, I keep a blog called Autism Policy and Politics. I had a post on that just a couple of days ago based on some recent research. Because on the one hand, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you're entitled to certain accommodations. So you think, might as well disclose. However, a recent study suggests that employment discrimination is real. Researchers sent various resumes and cover letters, and the resumes were identical and the cover letters were identical, except some of the cover letters mentioned either spinal cord injury or Asperger's. And guess what? The people with spinal cord injury and Asperger's got fewer interviews, got fewer calls for interviews. There's some variation in that, but prejudice is real. People are less likely to hire people with these disorders. So one has to approach this very carefully. I would suggest in the hiring process, the advice I'd give to a person on the spectrum is to be very careful about mentioning that in job materials. We have a student who had an article in the forum not long ago, and I know who the student is, who didn't directly mention his name because he didn't want somebody Googling him. And I think that was a very prudent decision on that student's part. And it's unfortunate that one has to give such advice, but this is the real world that we live in. And I hope that there's vigorous enforcement of anti-discrimination statutes under ADA.
I have a question myself. So as the title of your book suggests, Politics of Autism, you also mentioned in response to another question about there being interest groups with regards to autism, and those are important in terms of advocacy. But you also mentioned that with autism, every single person is different. So how do you draw the balance between allowing interest groups to speak, and they have to speak more generally, and having these individuals actually voice their individual, unique circumstances and concern?
Yeah, it's a heck of a problem. Organizing people with autism, organizing anybody is difficult. Those of you who've been engaged in any kind of organization know what a challenge it is. Organizing people with autism involves special challenges, including the disclosure. Because to join an autism organization means you're disclosing your autism to somebody else. And in the early days, it was very difficult for parents to come forward, to identify one another. And at the local level, being an advocate not just for your own kid in the IEP, but for other kids to come out and say, yes, I'm an advocate for autistic people because my child is autistic. That potentially subjects your child perhaps to bullying at school, to being labeled, oh, that's the autistic kid. All this is very difficult. And there's no simple answer to this. It's very difficult to do. I'm very glad, however, that there are a variety of national organizations pursuing this from a variety of perspectives. It's unfortunate, on the other hand, that these organizations are often so much at odds with each other. But in the world of interest groups, as people in my class know, the politics of just about any issue involves a lot of internecine warfare.
Excuse me, from the standpoint of states, California was always recognized as a state that really did wonderful things in this area. Are they still far above most other states from your research?
Yeah, here's one of the inequalities. I mentioned social class inequality. Another inequality is geography. Your fate depends on where you live. Here in Southern California, we're in reasonably good shape because of Ivar Lovaas. Lovaas taught at UCLA. And a lot of his students are now leaders in the field. Margie Charlap was a student of Lovaas. Doreen Granpeche, founder of the Center for Autism and Related Disorders, was also a Lovaas student. So you have a lot of Lovaas students in Southern California. Fairly affluent area, quite a few choices, rumor has it. South Dakota, if you look on the database of applied behavior analysts, I think in the entire state of South Dakota you can count on the fingers of one hand. West Virginia, very, very few options for behavior analysis. Now you take a state like Massachusetts, Connecticut, places that are affluent, places that have university centers, more to choose from. So a lot of it depends on the geography in that sense.
I wanted to ask a question myself. Something you mentioned in the head table was also international perspective. So do you know of any countries who have taken a very active approach to either inclusion of people with autism and promoting their rights in different ways, or are there kind of like model countries?
If anybody here is at CGU working on a PhD in comparative politics and you're looking for a dissertation topic, this is a great one. Because there's very little work on this. As far as I can tell from the fragmentary knowledge that we have, nobody has gotten it right. There are a lot, my mentor at graduate school, Ted Marmore, was a big fan of Canadian healthcare, and there's a lot of good things you could say about Canadian healthcare. They don't do a particularly good job on autism. So I wouldn't use them as a model. In France, unfortunately, they're kind of retrograde. They've never adopted applied behavior analysis. And so not a good place to be a person on the spectrum. As far as I can tell, no country has gotten it right. But Again, I say that with some hesitancy because of the absence. Now, one of the very few people who was working in this field who'd actually done some comparative stuff was a political scientist at Kent State University named Trudy Stornagel. And she and I established an email friendship. Never met her. And I hadn't heard from her for a while. And I Googled her name. She'd been murdered by her son, her son who had a variety of problems. And she never revealed in my communication with her how severe these problems were. And this is another case of somebody who obviously needed a lot more help than he was able to get. And in this case, it had tragic consequences. Okay, that's a downer, so let me okay, let me close on a happier note. You know, in the journey I've had in the past 13 years, it's not a death sentence. You hear, if ever you hear the words, "your child has autism," it's hard to take at first. Trust me on that. And your initial reaction is to grieve, and that's natural. But it's not a death sentence. A person with autism, if with applied behavior analysis, with a lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of luck, and a lot of concern, can be a productive member of society, can ace classes in school, can be in school plays, can win elections to student council, can be elected to student council in his first week in a new school, can kick butt in karate, can do all kinds of things. We'll always have some challenges, but who among us doesn't have challenges? So I don't want to leave you that everything is darkness, because the world of autism also encompasses a great deal of hope. And some of you have probably gathered whom I'm talking about.
Please join me in thanking Professor Pitney.